We've now fully described the system of creating things that appear on the screen in the browser and the system of taking in all the user inputs. The last thing I'm going to describe is a modern system of creating a complete application inside of that JavaScript browser environment. First, let's define the differences between a 90s era HTML web page and a modern era JavaScript enabled website. So over here, what we have is basically a document and it has some links and stuff, but there's nothing dynamic about it. When I click, there's no JavaScript running, and it's not very interactive. So most websites these days have this level of interactivity that's enabled by JavaScript. So when I do actions, the manipulations, the things that you see on the screen are all being powered by JavaScript. So when I can expand into things, all of these actions that I'm doing are being run by JavaScript. Specifically, what I mean is that there's a huge set of elements that are moving around the page being controlled by this JavaScript code. So when you're an engineering team and you want behavior like this, where all of the elements on the screen are interactive and can be manipulated by your application code, by your program, what kind of JavaScript do you need to write? All of the underlying fundamentals of how elements are moving around the page are exactly the same as I just got done describing. However, when you have this much complexity, you need other techniques in order to manage this complexity and make it easy to write the kind of code that has this many complex interactions. So the techniques that people are using today are employing libraries and other complex workflows for being able to write applications that are more complicated. And this is the next level of programming, which is to talk about systematizing the code that you write. So if we were to construct an application with the DOM code that we just wrote, eventually the number of elements that we manipulated with this code would get too large. And the next step in engineering this application would be to think about how we can organize and systematize the code that we are writing into some underlying JavaScript that runs that part. So specifically by that I mean the part that is manipulating all of the elements on screen. On Trello, whenever I move one of these boxes from this list to another list, the JavaScript is actually in charge of taking this element in the HTML and moving it over to this parent element. When I click on this box, the JavaScript is responsible for creating this larger element and populating it with all of this data. So the task of creating a modern web application that runs inside of JavaScript in the browser becomes quite complex without some kind of library code that's helping you manage all of the elements that need to be created and taken out of the screen. If you're creating a complex modern website, or if you're just creating a blackjack game, the underlying principles of logic and processing data are still exactly the same. In a really large application, there's other considerations about the total structure of the code, and you have many more ways to give input to a program like that and many other ways to give output. But the underlying logic is the same, and hopefully you've gotten a sense of how you can take this ability to transform data and extrapolate it out to something that seems more complex, like a Trello app.